The sword went straight through Cale Vantharian's chest, and for one long moment, the entire battlefield went silent. The soldier who had driven the blade home stumbled back, his face pale, his hands shaking. He had aimed for the heart. He had felt the blade sink deep, felt the crunch of bone, felt the warm rush of blood over his fingers. He had done everything right, yet Cale did not fall. Cale looked down at the sword sticking out of his own body, as if it were a curious insect that had landed on his sleeve. Then he looked up, and his eyes were calm in a way that made every man around him take a step back. "That was a good strike," Cale said quietly. "Better than most." He reached up, gripped the blade with his bare hand, and pulled it free. Blood poured from the wound, soaking his tunic, dripping onto the churned mud beneath his boots. The men around him watched in horror as the wound began to close on its own, the skin knitting together as if an invisible needle were stitching it shut. Within a minute, there was nothing left but a thin pink line and a torn shirt. The soldier who had struck him dropped his sword and ran. He was not the first to run that day, and he would not be the last. Word had already begun to spread through the ranks, whispered from one frightened mouth to another. The warlord could not be killed. Arrows bounced off him as if his skin were stone. Fire licked at his clothes and left him unburned. Poison passed through him like water through a sieve. Some said he had made a deal with a demon. Others said he was already dead and simply did not know it. The truth was worse than any rumor, though only Cale knew it, and he had stopped trying to explain it to anyone a long time ago. 10 years earlier, before the wars, before the betrayal, before any of this, Cale had been a young captain in the army of a kingdom called Verlan. He had been ambitious, clever, and hungry for power in a way that frightened even his closest friends. When the old general who commanded him refused to attack a neighboring province that Cale believed was ripe for conquest, Cale did not argue. He did not protest. He simply waited until nightfall and opened the gates of the camp to the enemy himself, trading the lives of 3,000 soldiers for a promise of command. The enemy kept their promise. Cale was given his army, but among the dead left behind in that betrayed camp was an old woman, a healer and a sorceress named Odessa, who had served the army faithfully for 20 years. She did not die quickly. She lived long enough to find Cale standing over the wreckage of his own treachery, admiring the smoking ruins of the camp he had just handed to his enemies. "You wanted to live forever," she had rasped, blood on her lips, her eyes burning with something far older and stranger than hatred. "So you shall. You will live forever, Cale Vantharian. You will watch every person you have ever loved grow old and die, while you remain exactly as you are now. Your body will never fail. Your heart, however, will turn to stone, piece by piece, year by year, until there is nothing left inside you but silence. This is not a gift. This is a cage, and you built the bars yourself." She died before he could answer her, and for a long time, Cale believed her words had been nothing more than the ravings of a dying woman. Then the years began to pass. He watched his soldiers age and die, while his own face never changed. He watched empires rise and crumble to dust while he remained exactly as he had been on the day of the curse. He fought in 100 wars, was struck by countless blades, was drowned, poisoned, and burned, and every single time, his body refused to let him go. At first, immortality had felt like victory. He had conquered kingdoms with an army that feared nothing, because their leader could not die. He had built a fortress on the edge of the world, a place called Ravenholt, where he ruled over a crumbling stretch of land that even maps had begun to forget. But somewhere along the long road of centuries, the victory had curdled into something else entirely. He no longer remembered the names of most of the men who had served under him 100 years ago. He no longer felt anything when his soldiers died in his name. He had simply stopped feeling much of anything at all. The sorceress had been right. His body could not be killed, but his heart had been dying the entire time, one small piece at a time, the way a stone wears smooth under centuries of rain. By the time this story truly begins, Cale had ruled Ravenholt for nearly 300 years. His fortress stood at the edge of a dark forest that travelers avoided if they had any sense at all. The villages nearby told their children stories about the monster in the mountain, the man who could not be killed, the shadow who walked the ruined halls of Ravenholt alone. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. Soldiers who wandered too close to his lands simply vanished, not because Cale hunted them, but because they fled at the mere sight of the fortress and lost themselves in the forest instead. Cale did nothing to correct these stories. In truth, he barely noticed them. He spent his days walking the same stone corridors he had walked for centuries, staring out the same narrow windows at the same gray sky, feeling less and less like a man with every passing year. His servants, the few who remained loyal enough or desperate enough to stay, rarely spoke to him unless spoken to first. They had learned, over the decades, that the warlord preferred silence to conversation, stillness to warmth, and solitude to almost anything else. On the night this story truly begins, a storm was rolling in from the eastern mountains, the kind of storm that turned rivers into floods and roads into rivers of mud. Far below Ravenholt, in the valley where the forest met the edge of the Old Kingdom, a group of refugees was fleeing a famine that had swept through their homeland like a plague. Among them walked families with children clutched tightly to their chests, elderly men leaning on walking sticks, and young mothers carrying whatever few possessions they had managed to save. They had chosen the forest path because it was faster, and because the soldiers patrolling the main roads had begun turning refugees away at the borders of the wealthier provinces. No one in the group wanted to go anywhere near Ravenholt. Everyone had heard the stories. But the storm was closing in fast, and the forest offered at least the promise of shelter beneath its ancient twisted trees. It was in the chaos of that storm, as thunder cracked overhead and rain turned the forest path into a river of mud, that a small girl named Mira became separated from the only family she had left. Mira was 6 years old, with dark curling hair that refused to stay tied back no matter how carefully her aunt braided it each morning, and eyes the color of warm honey. Her parents had died of fever 2 winters before, and since then, her aunt had cared for her as best she could, though the woman had 5 other mouths to feed and precious little to spare. When the famine came, the family had no choice but to join the long line of refugees walking toward whatever kindness the next province might offer. Mira had been holding her aunt's hand tightly when the storm broke. Lightning split the sky, and in the chaos that followed, a fallen tree crashed down between them, scattering the group into panicked fragments. Mira called out, but her voice was lost beneath the roar of thunder and the screams of frightened travelers. She ran in the direction she thought her aunt had gone, tripping over roots and stones, calling a name that no one answered. By the time the worst of the storm passed, Mira was utterly alone, soaked to the bone, and hopelessly lost in a forest that grew darker and stranger with every step she took. She did not know that she had wandered onto the grounds of Ravenholt. She only knew that ahead of her, through the sheets of rain, she could see the faint outline of tall stone walls and, somewhere within them, a single flickering light. Exhausted, frightened, and shivering, Mira did the only thing a lost child could do. She walked toward the light. She did not know that behind those walls lived a man who had not felt warmth, or fear, or hope, in longer than she could possibly imagine. She did not know the stories the villages told about the monster of the mountain. She only knew that she was cold and alone, and that somewhere ahead of her, there might be shelter from the storm. Above her, in a high window of the fortress, a tall figure stood watching the forest below, drawn by something he could not quite name. For 300 years, nothing in that forest had ever caught his attention. Tonight, something did. Cale Vantharian had felt nothing new in a very long time, yet as he watched a small shape moving through the storm below his window, stumbling, falling, and rising again, something stirred deep inside him that he did not recognize. It was faint and strange, and almost immediately he told himself it was nothing at all. But he did not look away from the window, not even once, until the small shape disappeared beneath the outer wall of his own fortress, and the storm swallowed the rest of the night whole. The courtyard gate of Ravenholt had not been opened for a stranger in over 80 years, yet on that stormy night, it groaned open on rusted hinges as if some old, forgotten instinct had guided it to move. Mira did not notice the gate opening. She only noticed that the rain had suddenly stopped falling on her head, and that the ground beneath her feet had turned to smooth, cold stone instead of mud. She stumbled forward a few more steps and then, unable to go any farther, sank down against a stone pillar in the courtyard, wrapping her thin arms around her knees and shivering violently. She was too tired to cry. She was too cold to call out for help. She simply closed her eyes and waited, the way children sometimes do when the world has become too large and too frightening to understand, hoping that if she waited long enough, someone kind would find her. Someone did find her, though he was not the kind of person she or anyone else would have expected. Cale had left his tower the moment the small shape vanished beneath his walls, moving through the dark corridors of his fortress with a speed and purpose he had not felt in decades. He told himself as he walked that he was simply investigating an intruder. Ravenholt received no visitors, welcomed no travelers, and tolerated no trespassers, and it made sense, he reasoned, to see who or what had wandered onto his grounds during the storm. He told himself many things on that long walk down to the courtyard. None of them explained the strange, urgent pull in his chest that had gotten him moving in the first place. When he stepped out into the courtyard, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and there, curled against a stone pillar, he saw her. A small girl, soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face, her small chest rising and falling in the shallow breaths of complete exhaustion. Cale stood frozen for a long moment, staring down at her. He had seen death in every form imaginable over the centuries. He had seen soldiers fall in battle, villages burn, entire kingdoms collapse into ash. He had long since trained himself not to feel much of anything at the sight of suffering, because feeling had become, for him, an old and unnecessary luxury. Yet something about this small, shivering child struck a note deep inside him that he had not heard in longer than he could remember. He crouched down slowly, the way one might approach a wild animal that could bolt at any moment, and reached out a hand toward her. Mira's eyes fluttered open. For a moment she simply stared up at the tall, dark figure looming over her, rain dripping from his shoulders, his face half hidden in shadow. Most grown men would have expected a child to scream at the sight of him. His face bore the marks of centuries of battle, old scars that never quite faded, eyes that had seen far too much to ever look entirely human again. Mira did not scream. She blinked at him, confused and exhausted, and said, in a small, hoarse voice, "Are you going to help me?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct in the way only a child's words can be. Cale found himself unable to answer immediately. It had been so long since anyone had asked him for anything without fear woven through every word. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "I am going to help you." He lifted her into his arms, and she was so light, so fragile, that for a moment he was reminded of just how easily a human life could be crushed, snuffed out, ended. He carried her inside, through the halls that had not heard the sound of a child's breathing in longer than history could account for, and brought her to the only room in the fortress that still held a fire burning through the night, his own private chamber near the top of the highest tower. He wrapped her in the warmest blanket he owned, an old fur that had once belonged to a king he had defeated centuries before, and set her near the fire. She was asleep again within minutes, her small body finally warm enough to rest. Cale sat across from her for the rest of the night, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft, even sound of her breathing. He told himself, over and over, that this was simply temporary. She would wake in the morning, he would find out where she belonged, and he would return her to her people, whoever they were. This was not a complication, this was not a change. This was simply an inconvenience that the storm had dropped onto his doorstep, and by tomorrow it would be resolved. He almost believed himself. When morning came, gray light spilling weakly through the tower windows, Mira woke slowly, blinking against the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, panic flickered across her face as she realized she did not recognize the room, the fire, or the strange man sitting silently across from her. Then the memory of the storm returned, and with it, the memory of a tall figure who had promised to help her. She sat up, clutching the fur blanket around her shoulders, and studied him carefully. He looked different in the daylight than he had in the storm. Taller, somehow, and stranger, with scars crossing his face and hands that told stories she could not begin to imagine. Most children would have been terrified. Mira, exhausted from days of walking and grief still weighing on her small shoulders, simply felt curious. "What is your name?" she asked. Cale studied her for a long moment before answering. "Cale," he said finally. "And you?" "Mira," she said. She looked around the room, taking in the cold stone walls, the sparse furniture, the complete absence of anything soft or warm, except the fire and the blanket wrapped around her. "This is a very big house. Do you live here alone?" The question struck something in him that he was not prepared for. He had lived alone in this fortress for so long that he had stopped thinking of his solitude as anything unusual at all. It simply was. The way the sky was gray, the way stone was cold, the way time continued to pass around him without ever touching him. "Yes," he said simply. "I live here alone." Mira frowned at this, the way children frown at things that seem obviously wrong to them, but that adults never seem to notice. "That sounds lonely," she said. Cale did not answer. He rose instead and moved toward the window, staring out at the forest below. The storm now cleared to reveal a pale, watery sunrise breaking over the treetops. Somewhere out there, he knew, her people would be searching for her. If they had survived the storm at all, he should send word. He should have his soldiers, the few loyal men who remained in his service, search the forest and find whatever remained of the group she had been traveling with. He should do all of this quickly, before the strange stirring in his chest had time to grow into something he could no longer ignore. "I will find your family," he said, without turning around. "You will not be here long." Behind him, Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice far too steady for a child who had just lost everyone she knew in a single stormy night, "My mother and father are already dead. I was walking with my aunt, but I do not know if she is alive either. I do not know if I have anyone left to find. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that Cale felt in places he had thought were long since numb. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to say. Mira did not cry as she said this. She simply stated it, the way children sometimes state the harshest truths of their lives, with a plainness that adults have long since learned to disguise. She had already cried, it seemed, all the tears she had for the moment, somewhere in the storm the night before, and now there was only the quiet, exhausted acceptance of a child who understood, perhaps too well for her age, that the world did not always give people back what it took from them. Cale crossed the room slowly and knelt in front of her, bringing himself down to her level, an act so foreign to him that his own knees protested the strange posture. "I will send men to search for your aunt," he said. "If she is alive, we will find her. But until then, you will stay here where it is warm, and where you are safe." Mira studied his face for a long moment, searching for something in his scarred features that most people would have found only fear. Instead, she seemed to find something else entirely, something that made her small shoulders relax just slightly. "Okay," she said simply, and reached out to take a piece of bread from the tray a servant had quietly left near the fire sometime that morning, eating with the simple, uncomplicated trust of a child who had decided, for reasons she could not have explained, that the strange man before her was not someone to fear. Cale watched her eat, and felt, for the first time in 3 centuries, something crack open inside his chest that he had long believed was sealed shut forever. Word travels quickly through a household, even one as small and quiet as the staff of Ravenholt had become over the centuries, and by the time the sun had fully risen, every servant in the fortress knew that the warlord had brought a child into his private chamber, and refused to let her leave his sight. An old steward named Edmund, who had served Cale longer than any other living soul in the fortress, was the first to voice the concern that every servant felt but few dared to speak aloud. He found Cale in the armory later that morning, sharpening a blade he had no intention of using, a habit he kept from centuries of restlessness rather than necessity. "My lord," Edmund said carefully, choosing each word as though it might shatter if handled roughly. "The girl in your chamber. What do you intend to do with her?" Cale did not look up from the blade. "I intend to find her family, if any remain, and return her to them. And if none remain." The question hung in the air between them, and Cale found that he had no ready answer for it. He set the blade down slowly. "Then I will find her a place among the villages nearby, a family who can care for her properly." Edmund studied his lord's face for a long moment, an expression of careful concern crossing his weathered features. "My lord, forgive me for saying this, but Ravenholt is no place for a child. The forest around us is full of danger, the villages fear this fortress and everyone in it, and you yourself have said many times that this place is no fit home for the living." Cale's jaw tightened at the reminder of his own words, spoken so many times over so many years that he had almost forgotten how true they had once felt. "I am aware of what I have said, Edmund. Then you understand why the girl cannot stay." "She will not stay," Cale said, more sharply than he intended. "She will be gone within the week, once I have found where she belongs." Edmund said nothing further, though the look on his face suggested he did not entirely believe his lord's words, and in truth, neither did Cale himself. That afternoon, Cale sent 3 of his most trusted soldiers into the forest to search for any sign of the refugee group Mira had described, following the muddy tracks left behind by dozens of travelers fleeing the storm. He gave strict instructions that they search thoroughly, question anyone they found, and return with news, whatever that news might be. While he waited for their return, he found himself, against every instinct that had guided him for the past 300 years, spending time in the company of the small girl who had upended the careful stillness of his existence in less than a single day. Mira, it turned out, was not a quiet child. She asked questions constantly, about everything from the strange scars on his hands, to why the fortress had so many empty rooms, to whether he had ever seen a dragon. Cale found himself answering these questions with a patience he did not know he still possessed, though many of his answers were shorter and more guarded than the girl's curiosity clearly wanted. "Why do you have so many scars?" she asked him that afternoon, as they sat together in the great hall, a room so large and so empty that her small voice echoed strangely against the stone walls. "I have fought in many battles," Cale said simply. "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Then why did you keep fighting if it hurt?" Cale paused at this question, turning it over in his mind the way one might turn over a stone to see what lay beneath it. He had fought in battles for so many reasons over the centuries, for power, for conquest, for the simple, grim momentum of a life that refused to end. He was not certain, in this moment, how to explain any of that to a 6-year-old girl who asked questions with the disarming honesty only children seemed capable of. "Sometimes," he said finally, "I did not know how to stop." Mira considered this answer with the same careful seriousness she gave to everything, then nodded, as though this made perfect sense to her, and moved on to her next question without further comment. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as rain once again began to patter softly against the windows of the great hall, that Mira began to hum. It was a simple tune, soft and repetitive, the kind of melody that seemed to have no clear beginning or end, the kind of song a mother might hum to a child while rocking them to sleep. Cale went very still the moment he heard it. He did not recognize the exact tune, and yet something about the shape of it, the rise and fall of the notes, struck a chord of memory so old and so deeply buried that he felt it before he understood it. He had heard a song like this once, centuries ago, sung by a woman whose face he could no longer clearly remember, in a life that felt now like it belonged to someone else entirely. "What is that song?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Mira stopped humming and looked up at him, surprised by the sudden intensity in his question. "My mother used to sing it to me," she said, "before she got sick. I do not remember all the words anymore, but I remember the tune." "Sing it again," Cale said, and though the words came out more like a command than a request, Mira did not seem to mind. She hummed the tune once more, softly, her small voice filling the vast emptiness of the great hall, in a way that made the ancient stone walls feel, for just a moment, less like a tomb and more like a home. Cale sat perfectly still throughout, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had changed, something that had not moved in longer than he could remember. When she finished, Mira studied his face carefully. "You look sad," she said. "I am not sad," Cale said, though even as he spoke the words he was not entirely certain they were true. "You look sad when I sing," Mira said again, with the stubborn insistence of a child who has decided something is true and will not be easily convinced otherwise. "Why does it make you sad?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, and Mira waited patiently, her honey-colored eyes fixed on him with an attention that few people had given him in centuries, an attention that held no fear at all, only curiosity, and something that might have been the beginning of concern. "It reminds me of someone I used to know," Cale said finally, choosing his words carefully. "A very long time ago." "Did she die?" "Yes." "I am sorry," Mira said, and she said it with such simple, genuine sympathy that Cale found himself momentarily unable to respond. Most people who spoke to him, when they spoke to him at all, did so with careful, calculated fear, choosing their words to avoid provoking his anger or drawing his attention. Mira spoke to him as though he were simply a person, someone capable of grief and sadness like anyone else, someone deserving of sympathy rather than fear. It had been a very long time since anyone had looked at him that way. That evening, the 3 soldiers Cale had sent into the forest returned, soaked and exhausted, with grim news. They had found the remains of the refugee camp scattered across the forest floor, torn apart by the storm, and among the survivors they had questioned, none had seen Mira's aunt since the moment the storm had separated the group. Some believed she had been swept away by the flooding river that cut through the eastern edge of the forest. Others believed she had simply become lost, as Mira had, and might yet be found somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding Ravenholt. The soldiers had searched the riverbank as thoroughly as the storm's continued rains allowed, but they had found no further sign of the woman, alive or otherwise. Cale received this news in the privacy of his study, away from Mira's presence, and found himself faced with a decision he had not expected to have to make so soon. He could send the soldiers back out to continue searching, though the chances of finding the woman alive grew slimmer with every passing day. He could send Mira to one of the nearby villages, where she might be taken in by a family willing to raise an orphan child, though he knew from centuries of experience just how difficult it was for a village already struggling with famine to take on another mouth to feed. Or he could do the thing that some quiet, long-buried part of himself was beginning, against every reasonable instinct, to want to do. He sat alone in his study for a long time that evening, turning the decision over in his mind, weighing 3 centuries of careful isolation against the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had begun to creep into his chest since the moment he had lifted a shivering child out of the storm and carried her inside his walls. He did not reach a decision that night, but when he finally rose from his desk and made his way back toward his chamber, he found himself walking more slowly than usual, as though some part of him were reluctant to face what he might have to tell her, and reluctant, too, to imagine the fortress falling silent again once she was gone. The next morning, Kale found Mira sitting cross-legged on the floor of his chamber, carefully arranging a handful of small stones she had gathered from the courtyard into a shape that, after a moment, he realized was meant to be a flower. "I found these outside," she said, without looking up, as though she had simply been waiting for him to arrive so she could explain her project. "They are not as pretty as real flowers, but I think they look nice anyway." Kale studied the small arrangement of gray and brown stones for a long moment. It did not look much like a flower in truth, but there was something in the careful, deliberate way she had placed each stone that struck him as remarkably similar to the effort men had once put into building great monuments, temples, and palaces, all in the hope of leaving something behind that might outlast them. "It is a fine flower," he said. Mira beamed up at him, clearly pleased by his approval, and Kale found himself once again unsettled by how easily her happiness affected him. He had not cared about anyone's approval or disapproval, nor sought to earn either, in longer than he could remember. Yet here he was, feeling a small, warm satisfaction at having pleased a 6-year-old girl with a handful of stones. He knew he needed to tell her about her aunt. He had put it off the evening before, telling himself he would find the right moment, though in truth, he suspected there was no right moment for news like this, only moments that felt slightly less wrong than others. "Mira," he said, sitting down carefully across from her, "I must tell you something about your aunt." Mira's small hands went still over her arrangement of stones, and she looked up at him with an expression far too serious for a child her age, an expression that told him she already suspected what he was about to say. "My men searched the forest," Kale continued, choosing his words with more care than he had chosen anything in a very long time. "They found the camp where your people had been traveling. Many of them survived the storm, but no one has seen your aunt since the night you were separated." Mira was quiet for a long moment, her honey-colored eyes fixed on the small stone flower in front of her, rather than on Kale's face. "Is she dead?" she asked finally, her voice small but steady. "I do not know," Kale admitted. "My men will continue searching, but I think it is possible that she is." He watched Mira carefully, uncertain what to expect, uncertain how a child so young might respond to news like this. He half expected tears, or screaming, or the kind of grief that overwhelms a person entirely and leaves them unable to function. Instead, Mira simply nodded slowly, as though she had already prepared herself for this possibility somewhere deep inside, and reached out to place one more stone onto her small gray flower. "Then I do not have anyone left," she said quietly. The simple, matter-of-fact way she said it struck Kale harder than any battle wound he had ever suffered. He had watched countless people die over the centuries, had caused the deaths of countless more, and had trained himself, out of necessity, not to feel the weight of any single loss too deeply. Yet something about this small girl, sitting on his floor and calmly accepting that she was now entirely alone in the world, cracked through every wall he had built around his heart. "You are not entirely alone," he heard himself say, before he had fully decided to say it. Mira looked up at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Kale found himself at a loss for words, uncertain how to explain the strange, unfamiliar impulse that had risen up inside him, an impulse he had not felt in 300 years and did not entirely trust. "I mean," he said slowly, "that you may stay here, at Ravenholt, for as long as you need." He expected the offer to feel like a burden, a complication to his carefully ordered existence, an intrusion into the solitude he had maintained for centuries. Instead, as the words left his mouth, he felt something entirely different, something that felt almost like relief. Mira studied him carefully, the way children sometimes study adults when they suspect an offer might not be entirely genuine. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it demanded an honest answer, and Kale found himself surprised by how quickly and clearly the answer came to him. "Yes," he said, "I believe I do." Mira's face broke into a small, tentative smile, the first true smile he had seen from her since the night he had found her shivering in his courtyard. "Okay," she said, "I will stay." Over the following days, word of Kale's decision spread quickly through the small staff of Ravenholt, and though most of the servants kept their opinions to themselves out of long habit and lingering fear, Edmund found himself compelled, once again, to voice his concerns directly to his lord. "My lord," he said, finding Kale alone in the fortress library one evening, "may I speak plainly?" Kale, who had grown accustomed over the centuries to Edmund's careful honesty, nodded. "You may." "This girl," Edmund said, "she cannot stay here forever. Ravenholt is not a place for children. It is cold, isolated, and surrounded by dangers that a girl her age cannot possibly understand. There are no other children for her to play with, no proper teachers to guide her education, no mother's care to raise her as she deserves to be raised. And there is. Edmund hesitated, choosing his next words with obvious care. There is the matter of what you are, my lord. Forgive me for saying it so plainly, but the villages call you a monster. If word spreads that you are keeping a child within these walls, I fear what conclusions people may draw, and what danger that might bring upon her. Cale listened to every word without interruption, and when Edmund finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of the old steward's concerns. You are not wrong, Cale said finally. Every reason you have given is sound. I am aware of what this fortress is, and what I am. I am aware of the danger my name alone might bring upon her. Then you understand why she cannot stay. I understand the risks, Cale said. But I have made my decision, Edmund. She stays, for now, until I can find her a proper home, one where she will be safe, and cared for, and free from whatever darkness clings to these walls and to me. Until then, she remains under my protection. Edmund studied his lord's face for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, as though he recognized, perhaps for the first time in centuries, a flicker of something in Cale that resembled the young man he must once have been, long before the curse had taken hold of him. As you wish, my lord, Edmund said quietly, and though his concerns remained, he did not raise them again that evening. That night, as Cale made his rounds through the quiet halls of his fortress, a habit born of centuries of restless wakefulness rather than any real necessity, he paused outside the small chamber that had been prepared for Mira, a room near his own that Edmund had, despite his misgivings, seen properly furnished with a warm bed and a small collection of borrowed toys gathered from the nearby village. Through the door he could hear Mira humming softly to herself, the same simple tune she had hummed in the great hall days before, the melody that had cracked something open inside him that he had thought sealed shut forever. He stood outside her door for a long time, listening, and for the first time in 300 years, the silence of Ravenholt did not feel quite so absolute. Weeks passed at Ravenholt, and with each one, the fortress began to change in ways so gradual that no single day felt remarkable, yet the sum of them, taken together, was nothing short of extraordinary. Mira settled into the rhythms of her new home with the easy adaptability that only children seem to possess, transforming empty stone corridors into playgrounds, quiet gardens into kingdoms of her own imagination, and the vast, echoing halls of Ravenholt into spaces filled, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, with laughter. Cale found himself changing too, though far more slowly, and with far greater resistance than the girl who had upended his careful, silent existence. He began each day still telling himself that this arrangement was temporary, that he was simply providing shelter to a child until a more permanent home could be found for her. Yet with each passing week, the search for that permanent home grew quieter in his mind, pushed further and further into some distant, unexamined corner of his thoughts. He found himself, more and more often, seeking out her company rather than avoiding it. He discovered that she had an endless curiosity about the world, asking him questions about the stars, about the creatures that lived in the forest, about the history of the crumbling fortress they now shared. He found himself answering these questions not with the clipped, guarded responses he gave to everyone else, but with something closer to genuine interest, surprising himself with how much he still remembered, and how much he still, apparently, had to say. One afternoon, as they walked together through the overgrown remains of what had once been a formal garden behind the fortress, Mira turned to him with a question that struck deeper than most of her usual curiosities. "Are you ever going to send me away?" she asked, her honey-colored eyes fixed on a patch of wildflowers growing stubbornly through the cracked stone path. Cale paused, considering his answer carefully. He had promised Edmund, and himself, that this arrangement was temporary. He had told himself over and over that a fortress like Ravenholt was no place for a child to grow up, surrounded by cold stone and old ghosts and a man who had long since forgotten how to be anything other than a monster to the world outside these walls. Yet standing there, watching her study the wildflowers with the same careful seriousness she gave to everything, he found that he could not bring himself to say yes. "I do not know," he said honestly. "This is not truly a place for a child, Mira. There are no other children here for you to grow up alongside, no proper teachers, no mother to guide you as you deserve. I fear that keeping you here does you a disservice, when there may be families in the villages nearby who could give you a better life." Mira considered this for a long moment, then shook her head firmly. "I do not want to go to the villages," she said. "I want to stay here, with you." "Why?" Cale asked, genuinely curious. "The villages fear this place. They fear me. Surely a warm home with a family who could love you properly would be better than a cold fortress with only an old warlord for company." Mira looked up at him, and there was something in her expression, some depth of understanding far beyond her 6 years, that caught him entirely off guard. "You are not scary," she said simply. "Everyone says you are a monster, but you have never scared me, not even once. And you are kind to me, even though you do not have to be. I do not think I would be happier with strangers, just because they are not as scarred as you are." Cale found himself without words, standing amid the overgrown wildflowers of a garden he had not truly seen in decades, listening to a 6-year-old girl explain, with more clarity than most adults ever managed, exactly why she trusted him. "I have nowhere else to go," Mira continued, when he did not respond. "You said I could stay for as long as I need. I need to stay. Please do not send me away." The plea in her voice, simple and direct, undid something in Cale that 3 centuries of solitude had never managed to touch. He knelt down in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level, and though the words that came next surprised even him, he did not hesitate to say them. "You may stay," he said, "for as long as you wish. I will not send you away, Mira. Not unless you ask me to." Mira's face broke into a wide, relieved smile, and before Cale fully understood what was happening, she had thrown her small arms around his neck, in an embrace so sudden and so genuine that he found himself entirely unprepared for it. He sat frozen for a moment, uncertain what to do with his hands, uncertain how to respond to a gesture of affection he had not received from another living soul in longer than he could accurately remember. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised one hand and rested it gently against her back, and something about the simple weight of her small body against his, trusting and unafraid, felt like the first genuine warmth he had experienced in 300 years. From that day forward, the question of whether Mira would stay at Ravenholt was quietly, without any formal declaration, settled. Cale stopped speaking of temporary arrangements. Edmund, though his concerns about the dangers surrounding the fortress and the risks of Cale's reputation never fully disappeared, began quietly making adjustments to accommodate a permanent young resident, from proper lessons arranged with a retired tutor in a nearby village, to small comforts added to her chamber that suggested a much longer stay than anyone had originally intended. Cale, for his part, began to notice changes in himself that both fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. He found himself smiling, an expression his face had grown so unaccustomed to that it felt strange and stiff each time it happened. He found himself laughing, quietly and briefly, at some small joke or clumsy joy Mira brought into his day. He found himself, for the first time since the curse had been placed upon him, looking forward to the passage of time rather than simply enduring it, counting the hours until Mira would wake each morning, eager to share whatever small discovery or question had occupied her thoughts overnight. Yet even as these small, warm changes took root within him, Cale could not entirely shake a quiet unease that lingered at the edges of his newfound happiness. He had lived long enough, and lost enough, to understand that warmth of this kind rarely came without a cost. The sorceress's curse had taken everything from him once before, every person he had ever loved, one by one, over centuries of watching mortal lives flicker and fade, while his own remained frozen and unchanging. He did not yet understand what price this new warmth might demand of him, but some old, weary part of him, hardened by 300 years of loss, suspected that a price was coming all the same. The first vision came to Cale on a quiet evening, nearly 2 months after Mira had arrived at Ravenholt, and it struck him with a force that no blade, no poison, no fire had ever managed to inflict upon his cursed body. He had been sitting in the great hall, watching Mira practice her letters on a slate Edmund had procured from the village, when a sudden, blinding pain shot through his skull, and the room around him seemed to dissolve into darkness. In the darkness, images began to form, sharp and vivid, images he had not seen in centuries but recognized instantly. He saw a woman's face, gentle and familiar, a wife he had loved and lost 300 years before, her features twisted in grief as she watched him fail to age alongside her. He saw a son, grown old and gray while his father remained forever young, dying alone in a bed while Cale stood at his side, unable to offer any comfort beyond the bitter irony of his own unchanging presence. He saw, one after another, every person he had ever allowed himself to care for across 3 centuries of cursed immortality, and every single one of them ended the same way, withering, aging, dying, while he remained exactly as he had always been. The vision lasted only a few seconds, though it felt to Cale like he had lived through centuries of grief all over again in that brief span of time. When it ended, he found himself gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, his breathing ragged, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool evening air. "Cale?" Mira's small voice cut through the fog of the vision, concerned and confused. "Are you okay?" He looked up at her, and for a moment, The vision's warning felt so overwhelming that he could barely bring himself to answer. This is what will happen to her. Some cold, ancient part of his mind whispered. You will watch her grow and age and die, just as you have watched everyone else. You will bury her, just as you buried them, and you will remain exactly as you are now, unchanged, uncaring, alone once more. I am fine, he said finally, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. Simply tired. Mira studied him with the careful attentiveness she gave to everything, clearly unconvinced by his explanation. But she did not press further, returning instead to her practice letters, with an occasional worried glance in his direction. That night, long after Mira had fallen asleep, Cale found himself standing alone in his study, staring at the small, tattered journal he had kept, on and off, across 3 centuries of cursed existence. He flipped through pages filled with names, dozens upon dozens of names, each one belonging to someone he had once cared for, someone he had eventually lost to the relentless passage of time. Wives, children, friends, soldiers he had fought alongside for decades before watching them grow old and fade away, while he remained untouched by the years. He had stopped adding names to that journal nearly 100 years ago, having convinced himself, after so many losses, that the wisest course was simply to stop caring altogether, to let his heart continue its slow transformation into stone, rather than subject himself to the endless cycle of loss the sorceress's curse had condemned him to endure. And now, after 100 years of careful, deliberate emptiness, a 6-year-old girl with dark curling hair and a simple humming tune had cracked through every wall he had built, and the old, familiar fear had come rushing back in to fill the space her warmth had created. The visions continued in the days that followed, growing more frequent and more vivid each time Cale allowed himself a moment of genuine joy in Mira's company. A shared laugh over some clumsy mistake in her lessons would be followed, hours later, by a searing image of her lying pale and still, aged and withered, while he remained forever young beside her grave. A quiet evening spent teaching her to identify the constellations from his tower window would end with visions of her funeral, her small body grown old and frail across decades he would watch pass without touching him. Cale began to withdraw, almost involuntarily, retreating into the careful distance he had maintained for so long before her arrival, hoping that if he simply loved her less, the visions might fade, and the old, familiar numbness might return to protect him from whatever pain was coming. Mira noticed the change almost immediately, her sharp, observant nature picking up on the subtle shift in his behavior long before he was willing to acknowledge it himself. "You have been sad again," she said to him one evening, as they sat together near the fire in his chamber, a routine they had settled into over the past weeks that Cale found himself, despite everything, reluctant to abandon. "I am not sad," Cale said, the same denial he had offered so many times before. "You are," Mira insisted, with the stubborn certainty of a child who refused to be talked out of an obvious truth. "You get quiet, and your eyes look far away, like you are thinking about something that hurts. It happens more now than it used to." Cale was quiet for a long moment, uncertain how much of the truth he owed to a child who could not possibly understand the weight of a 300-year-old curse, and uncertain, too, whether burdening her with such knowledge would help or harm her. "Sometimes," he said finally, choosing his words carefully, "I am afraid of losing the people I care about." Mira considered this with her usual seriousness. "Everyone is afraid of that," she said. "My mother used to say that being afraid of losing someone means you love them. She said it is better to love someone and be a little afraid than to never love anyone at all." The simple wisdom in her words, passed down from a mother Mira had already lost, struck Cale with unexpected force. He had spent 100 years convincing himself that the safest path was to feel nothing at all, to let his heart harden into stone rather than risk the pain of loss again. Yet here was a child, who had already lost everyone she had ever loved, telling him with complete conviction that love was still worth the risk of losing it. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," Cale said quietly. "She was," Mira agreed, and for a moment, a flicker of grief crossed her small features before she pushed it aside, the way children often do, moving quickly past pain toward whatever comfort was closest at hand. She reached out and took his scarred hand in both of her small ones, an act of simple, uncomplicated affection that caught him entirely off guard. "I am not afraid of losing you," she said. "I do not think you are going anywhere." Cale looked down at her small hands wrapped around his, and though the visions had warned him, over and over, of the pain that lay ahead if he allowed himself to love this child fully, he found, in that quiet moment, that he could no longer bring himself to retreat from her. Whatever price the curse demanded, whatever grief awaited him down whatever path this strange, unexpected love might lead, he found himself, for the first time in 300 years, willing to pay it. It was on a quiet evening, several weeks after the visions had first begun, that Kale finally found the courage to tell Mira the truth about who he had once been, and what had made him the way he was now. They sat together near the fire, as they often did, Mira curled beneath the same fur blanket she had been wrapped in on the night they first met, her honey-colored eyes fixed curiously on his face as he began to speak, his voice heavy with the weight of a confession he had carried, unspoken, for 3 centuries. "I was not always the man you see before you," he began, "a very long time ago, before this fortress, before any of the stories the villages tell about me. I was a soldier, a captain, in fact, in the army of a kingdom that no longer exists." Mira listened in silence, sensing, with the intuition children sometimes possess, that this was a story she needed to hear all the way through without interruption. "I was ambitious," Kale continued, "and I wanted more power than I had been given. When my commanding officer refused to pursue a conquest I believed would bring me glory, I betrayed him. I opened the gates of our camp to our enemies, in exchange for a promise of command over my own army. Thousands of soldiers died that night, men who had trusted me, men who had fought alongside me for years." He paused, his hands tightening slightly where they rested on his knees, and Mira, sensing his difficulty, reached out and placed one small hand over his, a silent gesture of support that gave him the strength to continue. Among the dead was a woman, a healer named Odessa, who had served that army faithfully for 20 years. She did not die quickly. Before she died, she cursed me. She told me that I would live forever, that my body would never age or fail, but that my heart would slowly turn to stone, piece by piece, as I watched everyone I loved grow old and die, while I remained unchanged. Mira's small face had grown solemn as he spoke, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. "Is that why you cannot die?" she asked quietly. "Is that why the villages call you a monster?" "Yes," Kale said. "For 300 years I have watched every person I have ever cared for age and pass away, while I remain exactly as I was on the night of the curse. I fought in countless wars. I built this fortress. I ruled over this land, feared by everyone who lived nearby, because they believed, rightly, that I could not be killed. Over time I stopped allowing myself to care for anyone at all, because the pain of losing them, over and over, was more than I could bear. My heart began to turn to stone, just as the curse promised, until I felt almost nothing at all." He turned to look at her directly, his expression grave. "I have done terrible things, Mira. I betrayed men who trusted me. I have caused suffering I can never undo. The villages are right to fear me. I am not the gentle man you have known these past months. I am the monster they say I am, or I was, once, and some part of that monster still lives inside me." He expected her to recoil, to finally understand the danger she had been living alongside for the past 2 months, to ask, perhaps, to be taken to one of the villages after all, away from the cursed warlord who had confessed, at last, to the true weight of his past. Instead, Mira was quiet for a long moment, her small hand still resting over his, her honey-colored eyes searching his face with the same careful seriousness she gave to everything. "Did you feel bad about what you did?" she asked finally. "The soldiers who died. Do you feel sorry?" "Every day," Kale said honestly. "For 300 years I have felt sorry." "Then you are not the same person who did those things," Mira said with a simple, unshakable conviction that caught him entirely off guard. "My mother used to say that people can change, even when they have done bad things, as long as they are truly sorry and try to do better. You have been kind to me. You saved me from the storm. You let me stay here, even though you did not have to. That does not sound like a monster to me." "Mira," Kale said, his voice rough with an emotion he could barely name, "you do not understand. The things I did." "I understand that you were sorry," Mira interrupted, with the stubborn certainty that had become so familiar to him over the past months. "And I understand that you have been good to me, every single day since you found me. Maybe you were a bad person once, but you are not a bad person now. You are just a person who made mistakes a long time ago, and who has been sad about it ever since." She scooted closer to him on the bench they shared, and to his astonishment, she began, very softly, to hum the same tune she had hummed since the earliest days of her arrival, the lullaby her mother had once sung to her. Kale sat frozen, listening, as the familiar melody wrapped around the confession he had just made, softening its edges, easing its weight. When she finished humming, Mira looked up at him, her small face full of a conviction that seemed far too large for her 6 years. "You're not a monster to me," she said simply. "You never have been." Cale found himself unable to speak, his throat tight with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in 300 years. He had confessed the full weight of his past to another living soul for the first time since the curse had been placed upon him, expecting judgment, expecting fear, expecting, perhaps, the final confirmation of everything he had come to believe about himself over the centuries. Instead, he had received something he had long since stopped believing he deserved: forgiveness, freely given, from a child who had lost everything and yet still found room in her small heart to believe that a monster might, in fact, still be a man worth loving. He reached out hesitantly and took her small hand in both of his, holding it as though it were the most fragile and precious thing he had touched in 300 years, which, in many ways, it was. "Thank you," he said quietly, and though the words felt inadequate to the enormity of what she had just given him, Mira simply smiled up at him, satisfied, and settled back against his side to watch the fire burn low, entirely unaware of just how deeply her simple, childlike faith had begun to unravel the curse that had bound him for 3 long centuries. The rumor reached the capital nearly 3 months after Mira had first arrived at Ravenholt, carried by a traveling merchant who had heard whispers in a village near the forest's edge, whispers that spoke of a small girl seen through a tower window, of servants who had glimpsed her playing in the fortress courtyard, of a monster who had, for reasons no one could explain, taken a child captive within his cursed walls. The rumor grew with each telling, as rumors often do, until by the time it reached the ears of a young commander named Peter Ashford, stationed at a garrison 2 days' ride from the forest, it had transformed into something far more sinister than the truth. The warlord of Ravenholt, the story now claimed, had stolen a child from a group of refugees fleeing famine, holding her prisoner within his fortress for purposes too dark to name, feeding on her innocence to sustain his unnatural, cursed life. Commander Ashford was a young man, ambitious and eager to prove himself, and the prospect of finally ridding the region of the ancient monster that had haunted local legends for centuries, while simultaneously rescuing an innocent child from captivity, struck him as an opportunity too significant to ignore. Within a week, he had gathered a force of 40 soldiers, all volunteers eager to make their names as the men who finally brought down the warlord of Ravenholt, and set out toward the forest that most sensible travelers had learned, over the centuries, to avoid entirely. Word of the approaching soldiers reached Cale 3 days before they arrived, carried by a frightened woodsman who had spotted the column marching through the eastern edge of the forest, and, out of some lingering sense of loyalty or simple fear of what might happen if he did not warn the fortress, made the long journey to Ravenholt to deliver the news himself. Cale received the warning in his study, his expression darkening as he listened to the woodsman's account of the soldiers' numbers and their stated purpose. "They believe I am holding a child captive," Cale said slowly, once the woodsman had finished. "They intend to rescue her, and to end my life in the process." "That is what I heard, my lord," the woodsman confirmed, wringing his cap nervously in his hands. 40 men, maybe more by now. They mean to reach Ravenholt within 3 days. After the woodsman had been thanked and sent on his way with enough coin to ease his journey home, Cale sat alone in his study for a long time, considering the impossible choice that had suddenly been placed before him. If the soldiers arrived believing Mira was being held against her will, no explanation he offered would likely convince them otherwise. 300 years of fearsome reputation could not be undone by a single conversation, however honest. They would attempt to take her by force, and in doing so, they would very likely be killed, cut down by whatever soldiers still remained loyal to Ravenholt, adding 40 more deaths to a legacy already burdened with far too many. Or he could send Mira away before the soldiers arrived, hiding her somewhere safe until the misguided rescue attempt had come and gone, protecting both her and the young commander's men from a confrontation that could only end in tragedy. He found Edmund later that evening and explained the situation, watching the old steward's face grow increasingly troubled as the details of the approaching threat became clear. "You must send her away, my lord," Edmund said immediately. "Hide her in the village, or send her further south, anywhere beyond the reach of these soldiers, until this matter has passed." "And if they search the fortress and find nothing?" Cale asked. "Will they simply leave in peace, having marched 2 days through hostile forest for nothing? Or will they turn their anger toward me regardless, believing I have hidden her away to protect my own crimes?" Edmund had no ready answer for this, and Cale, watching the old steward's troubled silence, understood that there was no path through this situation that did not carry significant risk, both to Mira's safety and to the lives of the soldiers marching toward them, misguided though their mission might be. He found Mira that night in her chamber. and explained, as gently as he could manage, the situation now bearing down upon them. "Soldiers are coming," he said. "They believe I have taken you against your will, and they intend to take you from me by force, and to end my life in the process." Mira's eyes widened with fear, though not, Cale noted with some relief, fear of him. "They cannot do that," she said immediately. "You have not hurt me. I want to stay here." "I know," Cale said, "but they do not know that, and I fear that no words of mine will convince them otherwise. I believe the safest course is for you to leave Ravenholt before they arrive, perhaps to stay in the village with a family who can protect you until this danger has passed." "No," Mira said, with a firmness that surprised him. "I do not want to leave. I do not want to hide from soldiers who think you are hurting me, when it is not true. I want to stay with you." "Mira, this is not safe." "Neither is sending me away," Mira interrupted, her small chin set with a stubbornness that reminded Cale, not for the first time, of the remarkable strength hidden within her small frame. "If they come here and I am gone, will they believe you did something to me? Will they hurt you because they think you have hidden me away, or hurt me, and there is no one to tell them the truth?" Cale had no answer for this, because he suspected, with a heavy certainty, that she was right. His absence of explanation, combined with her sudden disappearance, would likely only confirm the soldier's worst suspicions, leading to violence regardless of whether Mira remained at the fortress or not. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked quietly, genuinely uncertain, for the first time in centuries, what path forward might avoid disaster entirely. Mira considered this with her usual seriousness, her small hands twisting together in her lap. "When they come," she said finally, "let me talk to them. Let me tell them the truth myself. Maybe if they hear it from me, they will believe it, instead of believing whatever story has made them come here to fight you." Cale studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk of allowing a 6-year-old girl to face 40 armed soldiers directly, against the almost certain violence that would follow if he tried to hide her, or if he simply refused to let the soldiers near her at all. "It is dangerous," he said finally. "If they do not believe you, or if fear overtakes their judgment, I cannot promise you will be safe." "I trust you to keep me safe," Mira said simply. "You have kept me safe since the night you found me in the storm. I do not think that is going to change now." Cale looked down at her small, determined face and felt once again the strange, unfamiliar weight of being trusted so completely by someone who had every reason, given the truth of his past, to fear him instead. He did not know, in that moment, whether her plan would save them both, or whether it would lead only to greater tragedy when the soldiers finally arrived. But he found, as he looked into her steady, honey-colored eyes, that he could not bring himself to refuse her. "Very well," he said finally. "When they come, you may speak to them, but you will stay close to me, and if there is any danger at all, you will let me protect you, without argument." Mira nodded solemnly, sealing the agreement, and Cale found himself, as the fortress settled into an uneasy quiet that night, watching the horizon for the first signs of the soldiers he knew were drawing steadily closer, carrying with them a confrontation that would decide, one way or another, the fate of everything he had rebuilt over these past 3 quiet months. The soldiers arrived at dawn on the 3rd day, exactly as the woodsman had warned, their column emerging from the tree line just as the pale morning light began to spread across the valley below Ravenholt. Commander Peter Ashford rode at the front, his young face set with the grim determination of a man convinced he was about to become a hero, his sword already drawn as he led his men toward the fortress gates. Cale watched them approach from the highest tower, Mira standing beside him, her small hand gripped tightly in his. Below them, the outer gates of Ravenholt stood open, an invitation Cale had ordered against Edmund's frantic objections, choosing transparency over the fortified defiance that might have provoked the soldiers into a siege rather than a conversation. "Are you scared?" Mira asked quietly, looking up at him as the sound of marching boots grew louder in the courtyard below. "A little," Cale admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. In 300 years, he could not recall the last time he had genuinely feared for an outcome, having long since grown accustomed to a body that could not be harmed by any blade or arrow. But the fear he felt now was different, sharper, rooted entirely in the small hand gripped in his own, rather than in any threat to himself. "I am not scared," Mira said, with the steady conviction that had carried her through every hardship since the night of the storm. "I know what is true. I just have to tell them." Together, they descended to the courtyard, arriving just as Commander Ashford and his 40 soldiers filed through the outer gates, weapons drawn, eyes darting warily across the ancient stone walls that generations of frightened villagers had spoken of only in whispers. "Warlord Vantharian," Commander Ashford called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the practiced authority of a man determined not to show fear before his own men. "We have come for the child you have taken captive. Release her, and I promise you a swift end. Resist, and we will take her by force." Kale stepped forward, Mira still close beside him, and felt the collective tension of 40 soldiers sharpen at his approach. "I have taken no one captive," he said, his voice calm despite the danger surrounding them. "This girl came to me during a storm 3 months ago, lost and alone, her family gone. She has remained here of her own will ever since." "A likely story from a monster who cannot be trusted," Ashford spat back. Though Kale noted a flicker of uncertainty cross the young commander's face at the sight of the girl standing so calmly, so clearly unafraid, beside the very man he had ridden here to destroy. It was Mira who broke the tension, stepping forward before Kale could stop her, her small figure standing alone between the warlord and the 40 armed soldiers who had come to save her. "He is telling the truth," she said, her clear young voice carrying surprisingly far across the silent courtyard. "I got lost in the storm. My aunt and I were separated, and I do not know if she is alive. Kale found me shivering in the rain and brought me inside. He has taken care of me every single day since then. He has never once hurt me." Ashford stared at her, clearly caught off guard by the calm, steady conviction in her voice, so unlike the frightened, traumatized child he had expected to find. "You need not be afraid to speak the truth," he said carefully. "If he has threatened you, or your family, you may tell us. We will protect you." "I am not afraid," Mira said firmly. "I am telling you the truth because it is the truth. He is not a monster. He saved my life, and he has been kind to me every day since. If you hurt him, you will be hurting the only family I have left." A murmur rippled through the assembled soldiers, uncertainty spreading visibly through their ranks, as they took in the calm, unwavering conviction of the small girl standing before them. Ashford himself seemed shaken, his sword lowering slightly as he studied Mira's face, searching for any sign of the fear or coercion he had expected to find and finding. Instead, only steady, unshakable belief. But belief, however genuine, was not enough to undo 300 years of fearsome legend in a single moment. From somewhere near the back of the assembled soldiers, a voice called out, harsh with the accumulated fear of generations who had grown up on stories of the monster of Ravenholt. "She is a child. She does not understand what he truly is. We did not march 2 days through that cursed forest to be talked out of our purpose by a frightened little girl who has been made to fear speaking otherwise." The shout ignited something restless among the soldiers, doubt and fear tangling together into a dangerous energy that Ashford, young and inexperienced in the face of genuine uncertainty, struggled to contain. Several soldiers surged forward, weapons raised, moving toward Mira with the misguided conviction that they were rescuing her from a captor too dangerous to be reasoned with. Kale moved instantly, placing himself between Mira and the advancing soldiers, his body angled to shield her completely from whatever violence they intended. He raised no weapon of his own, offered no threat, simply stood as a wall between the small girl and the men who believed, however wrongly, that they were protecting her. "If you must strike," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority that stilled, if only for a moment, the advancing soldiers. "Strike me. She has done nothing. She deserves none of your fear or your fury. Whatever judgment you have brought for me, deliver it, but you will not touch her." The soldiers hesitated, uncertain, their advance faltering in the face of a man who offered no resistance, no threat, only his own body as a shield for a child he clearly loved beyond any reasonable measure. Ashford, watching this unfold, felt the last of his certainty crumble entirely, replaced by a dawning understanding that the story he had marched 2 days to correct was not the story unfolding before him at all. It was in that exact moment, as Kale stood unarmed and unflinching between Mira and 40 soldiers, offering his own body in complete, selfless protection of a child he had chosen to love despite every warning his cursed heart had given him, that something ancient and long dormant finally broke. A blinding light erupted from Kale's chest, so sudden and so brilliant that every soldier in the courtyard staggered backward, shielding their eyes against a brightness that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within him, rather than from any external source. Mira gasped, gripping the back of his coat tightly as the light intensified, pulsing outward in slow, rhythmic waves that seemed to match the beating of a heart finally, after 3 centuries, remembering what it meant to feel. Kale felt it before he understood it, a sensation unlike anything he had experienced in 300 years, as though something that had been frozen solid within his chest was suddenly, painfully, wonderfully beginning to thaw. The old sorceress's curse had promised him a heart that would slowly turn entirely to stone, cold and unfeeling, punished eternally for the selfishness and betrayal that had defined the man he once was. But standing here now, offering his own body without hesitation to protect a child who loved him not, despite his scars but simply because of who he had chosen to become, Cale understood, in a single overwhelming instant, that the curse had finally found the one thing it could not withstand. Genuine, selfless love, given freely, and without any thought of reward or safety, was not the stone the curse had promised. It was the very opposite, warm and unbreakable, and it shattered the ancient magic binding him, as easily as morning light dissolves the last shadows of a long, dark night. The light faded slowly, leaving the courtyard in stunned silence, every soldier staring in disbelief at the sight before them. Cale remained standing, Mira still gripping his coat tightly, but something about him had changed in ways none of them could immediately name. For the first time in 300 years, Cale Vantharian felt his own heart beating, fast and warm and entirely, gloriously alive. For a long moment after the light faded, no one in the courtyard moved. Commander Ashford stood frozen, his sword still lowered, staring at the man he had marched 2 days to destroy, uncertain what he had just witnessed or what it meant for the confrontation that had brought them all to this place. Cale himself felt strangely unsteady, as though the ground beneath him had shifted in some fundamental way he could not yet fully understand. He lifted a hand to his own chest, feeling the rapid, unmistakable rhythm of a heartbeat pounding beneath his ribs, a sensation so foreign after 3 centuries of cursed stillness that he nearly staggered under the weight of it. "What happened to you?" Mira asked, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes, her small hand still clutching the back of his coat. "I do not know," Cale admitted, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the uncertainty in his voice felt less like fear and more like wonder. "I believe the curse has broken." Word of what the soldiers had witnessed spread quickly through their ranks, whispered from one stunned face to another, until even the man who had shouted his fear and fury moments before now stood in uneasy silence, uncertain what to make of a warlord who had shown no violence, only unwavering protection of a child who clearly loved him without hesitation. Commander Ashford lowered his sword fully, sheathing it slowly as he approached, his earlier certainty replaced entirely by a cautious, searching curiosity. "I came here believing I would find a monster holding an innocent captive," he said. "I do not know what I have found instead, but it is clearly not what the stories told." "The stories were built on fear," Cale said quietly, "and fear rarely tells the whole truth of anything. I have done terrible things in my past, Commander. I do not ask you to forget them, or to forgive them on my behalf. But whatever I once was, I have spent these past 3 months trying, in whatever small way I could, to become something better." Ashford studied him for a long moment, then looked to Mira, who gazed back at him, with the same steady, unshakable conviction she had shown throughout the entire confrontation. "And you," he said gently, "you are certain you wish to remain here, of your own choice?" "Yes," Mira said immediately, without a single trace of hesitation. "This is my home now. He is my family." Something in the simple, unwavering certainty of her answer seemed to settle whatever doubt remained among the assembled soldiers. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons, and Ashford, after a long moment of consideration, gave the order for his men to stand down entirely, the confrontation that had seemed destined to end in tragedy, dissolving instead into a wary, uncertain peace. Before departing, Ashford approached Cale one final time, his young face still troubled by the strange events he had witnessed. "I will tell the villages what I have seen here," he said. "I cannot promise they will believe me, or that the old fears will fade quickly. 300 years of stories do not disappear in a single morning. But I will tell them the truth, as best as I understand it." "That is all I could ask," Cale said, and meant it fully, understanding, for the first time in centuries, just how much the truth, freely and honestly told, was worth. In the weeks that followed, Cale's transformation continued in ways both subtle and profound. Without the curse's ancient grip upon him, he found that his body, for the first time in 300 years, had begun to age once more. Small changes he noticed in the mirror each morning, faint lines forming at the corners of his eyes, a weariness in his limbs after a long day's work that felt entirely unfamiliar and yet, somehow, deeply welcome. He was mortal again, vulnerable to time and to loss in ways he had not experienced in centuries, and rather than fearing this vulnerability, he found himself embracing it with a gratitude he could hardly put into words. Ravenholt itself began to change alongside him. Edmund, initially cautious about the strange turn of events, soon found himself smiling more often than he had in decades, the old fortress slowly shedding its reputation as a place of fear and isolation. Villagers who had once avoided the surrounding forest entirely began, cautiously at first, to venture closer, curious about the stories Commander Ashford had carried back with him, stories of a warlord who had chosen protection over violence, love over fear. Cale made the decision, not long after the confrontation in the courtyard, to leave Ravenholt behind entirely, choosing instead to build a smaller, simpler home at the edge of the nearby village, a place where Mira could grow up surrounded by other children, proper teachers, and a community no longer bound by 3 centuries of fearful legend. The ancient fortress, with all its cold stone corridors and heavy haunted history, was left behind, a monument to a past both of them were finally ready to move beyond. On the evening they moved into their new home, a modest cottage with a warm hearth and windows that let in far more sunlight than any room in Ravenholt ever had. Mira sat beside Cale on the small porch, watching the sun set gently over the village below. "Do you miss the fortress?" she asked, resting her head against his arm. "No," Cale said, and found, to his quiet surprise, that the answer was entirely true. "I do not miss the stone, or the silence, or the solitude. I do not miss the years I spent believing that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything." Mira smiled at this, and after a moment, she began to hum the same simple tune she had hummed on that very first night, the lullaby her mother had once sung to her, softened now by 3 months of shared warmth and belonging rather than grief alone. Cale listened, letting the melody wash over him, no longer carrying the sharp, painful weight it once had. It had become something else entirely now, no longer a reminder of everything he had lost across 3 centuries of cursed immortality, but a quiet, steady promise of everything he had finally found. "You're not a monster to me," Mira said softly, echoing the words she had spoken to him so many months before, words that had, without either of them fully realizing it at the time, begun the slow, quiet process of breaking a curse 300 years in the making. "No," Cale agreed, wrapping his arm gently around her small shoulders as the last light of the sun faded into a warm, gentle dusk. "I do not believe I am, not anymore." And as the stars began to appear, one by one, over their new home, Cale Vantharian, once feared across the land as an immortal warlord, bound by an unbreakable curse, finally allowed himself to simply be a man, mortal and imperfect, and entirely, gratefully alive, sitting beside the small girl whose simple, unwavering love had given him back the one thing 3 centuries of cursed existence had nearly taken from him forever: his own heart.